Hello, all listeners. I want to put it like that because I really think it's just like three of
We're
us.
here.
We're at Blue Sky Ventures. We're an M&A firm based out of Vancouver, British Columbia, in Canada, and we're all just getting together to have just a fun chat about what typically buyers want to look at when they're valuing a business. So I'm here with Paul, Joyce, and I'm Rusty, and so we're just going to get started real quick here, and we're going to go through a couple of quick elements that we like to see just off the bat, and we kind of expect our buyers to as well. So just to kick this off, we're going to start by saying the most fun part for us, especially, and for most buyers, is the financials. So, Paul, maybe we can quickly talk a little bit about what are the first sets of things you look at when you've got the income statement, a balance sheet, and sometimes a cash flow statement. What are some of the first quick things you want to look at?
I want to look at the revenue and the trends of the revenue. If it's going up, if it's going down, is it going sideways? How much is it growing each year? If I've got access to industry information, then I'm going to compare that revenue to other businesses in that industry. And then you want to look at the ad backs. And I'll let you talk about the ad backs, Rusty, but you want to look at the ad backs and see if they're fair and they're reasonable, and lastly the Ebitda and see what that is. But what kind of ad backs do you look for, Rusty?
I mean, so just to give a quick background on, sorry.
And what's fair for a good ad back?
And what's fair is can be sometimes subjective to each buyer. But when I look at ad backs, like just to build on what you said, the typical horizontal, vertical analysis of the financials, trends, all that great stuff, very important. Ad backs are kind of in smaller businesses, just a bit of background, smaller businesses tend to want to be as tax efficient as possible. So they want to show as little profit. So a lot of business owners tend to add a lot of perhaps non-recurring expenses or personal expenses. Like they'll put their personal car lease into the business. They'll put, perhaps sometimes they pay their kids through the business. Whether or not they're working in the business is a debatable question. But so it's about figuring out what those ad backs are. So most brokers will value a business based on what we like to think is a normalized Ebitda, or earnings before interest, depreciation, taxes, and amortization. Or if it's a seller's discretionary income or earnings situation where perhaps an owner is the key employee in that situation. And so those ad backs are usually things like personal or non-business related or non-recurring expenses that people dig into. And I've seen some, and I'm sure Paul and Joyce, you both have too, some very random ad backs too. I had a person that added back bad debts, and I, as a person, don't agree with that. But see, that's subjective. Sometimes people have a justification for what that was.
Yeah.
And so it's always good to dig into those ad backs.
What about, let me give you a question then. Would you allow an ad back, which means take it away from your expenses, for golfing fees?
Yes and no. That's a trick question.
Oh no. Yes or no?
Because golfing can be business.
Golfing fees, exactly. If it's a business expense in the way that the business owner is doing all their business development on the golf course.
Yeah,
that's where all their leads come from. That's where he or she networks with their clients. Is the new owner going to play golf? This is the question. Right?
We don't know, and maybe it's just required to go golfing with your suppliers or your largest clients.
Totally.
You should know that going into a business. So that's part of the valuation of the business.
And Joyce, you said something there too, right? Like you said also kind of like yes or no.
Well, it is, because it's exactly what you said, because not only is it a golfing expense, it's the same thing as if you're taking somebody out for lunch, right? It's a meal expense or a travel expense. So if you're traveling and you're on a trip, but guess what? You've gained some clients from your travel, and you haven't gone very far, but you've gained clients, and that's your way of gaining.
Yeah.
And I guess any buyer is gonna evaluate whether those ad backs are reasonable to them.
And I would say like maybe half, right? Like, I mean, you can't write off like, oh, okay, I went to Cuba and it was a business trip. Like, no, like you can't do that, right? But the thing is like in my, the parts that I do, we're in Saskatchewan. And so if I go to Saskatchewan for a business, and I'm at the hotel and I meet 3 businessmen that want to buy other businesses and stuff like that, well, then why not? Right?
Yeah.
So it's all different. Like, it's not a holiday. You're trying to
Is it
accumulate.
work related and is it drive?
Yes.
Is it a
Yeah. So it's
contributor?
very different. So I would investigate that a little bit more as
Totally.
to what are these ad backs for,
Yeah.
right? And where did you utilize them? How often did you utilize them throughout the year as well?
Why don't we switch topic a little bit? What about multiples? Like, we hear a lot of people talking about multiples for the valuation of the business.
Yeah.
Jurassic, in your opinion, is there kind of like a rule of thumb? Is it 3 times, 5 times, 8 times, 20 times, 2 times? What's a good multiple to buy a business?
I mean, this is again a trick question from Paul.
Ah.
And the answer to most things in life is it depends on the situation. And multiples, I mean, sometimes people look at it and say, hey, the broker just slapped a 3-time multiple, right? But there's a lot more that goes into that multiple calculation. You know, is the business owner instrumental to the business? Do they have management team in place? Is the business growing, or are the numbers comparable to other businesses in its industry? There's so many factors that go into it. You're paying a multiple because you're basically buying predictability. Like, let's call it what it is.
Yeah.
You're not starting a business from scratch. Someone's already done that 0 to 100 legwork. You're coming to take it from 100 to 200 to 1,000. But they've already figured out the systems. Hopefully they figured out most of their employees, customers, suppliers. And so you need to value, how much am I going to pay for that? Like, is it worth that time?
Yeah.
And so, Paul, I guess I want to flip it back to you and say, you know, how do you value a multiple? And how would you link that multiple to ROI? Because they're they're linked together.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's a good question. Like, there are sort of general rules of thumb, and there's always exceptions to the rule. But you know, if you were to take the industry out of it, the company out of it, location out of it, you know, you can see like the Ebitda. If you have a business that's the Ebitda or the SDE, seller's discretionary earnings, is $50,000 to $100,000, you're not going to get a 5 times multiple of that.
No.
The larger the company is, the more systems in place, the more predictability of their income. You know, you
lower risk to new buyer too, right? Like, that's
the Ebitda is like risk assessment. So if there's lower risk, higher multiple for sure. You know, you want to go buy Google, Apple, go look at the multiple on the price to earnings, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
But a smaller business, typically if it's owner operator, you know, it's 2.5 times if you're lucky, depending on the business. If it's larger, if you've got like 500,000 Ebitda, if there's management in place, you could go 4 times multiple.
Quite comfortably, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. It's art and science a little bit, right? It's not as clear cut 3 times or 5 times. So when people just say, I just want like a 3 times or 4 times multiple, or it's too expensive, you have to dig a little bit deeper for sure.
Totally.
And do your due diligence on it.
Yeah, absolutely. And at the end of the day, as a buyer, you're going to decide whether you want to pay that premium or not, right? Like, whenever you are buying stocks, like Paul very perfectly pointed out, you look at a PE ratio, right? Like, that's essentially what a multiple is. And a PE ratio is, are you willing to pay that premium for that script or stock to kind of gauge, okay, is the market price, I hate to use the word fair, but is it a fair market price here? And ultimately, the market will. We can list a business for 10 times. The market will decide what that business is actually worth.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's other value in a business besides just the financial returns and the multiple. There's time, and to think about it, if you were to buy a business with 10 or 15 employees already, think about how much time it would cost you in time to go out, write a job description, advertise it, interview people, review CVs, interview them again, write the employment contract, non-disclosure agreements, get all the paperwork ready, train them.
I start thinking about it now.
Yeah, it's not difficult. It really isn't difficult, but it's just so time-consuming that you'd be better use of your time working on the business, growing it, rather than, you know, just hiring people and
then they have to get up to speed too, right, Paul? Like, it takes people a couple of months to really, you know, get into
3 months. 3 months. It 3 months for a new hire. And do you want a new hire to put all that time and energy, and it's halfway through the second month, they don't like it. So then you're back to square one right again. And
how much is your time worth? Like, if it's going to take you 10 hours per hire and you've got 10 new hires to do, you know, that's 100 hours. And how much is your time worth per hour? So there's that value as well that I would be thinking about. Systems, processes, management, all that.
Yeah, and I guess that's what you're paying for when you're looking to buy a business of your own that's already pre-existing. You know, these points that we talked about now are all interlinked. They're all interlinked. Because you have, as a buyer, you need to look at all these points. Paul, what would you say now that you've seen enough deals? What would you say, or if you were to rank the points we talked about today, looking at financials, employees, ROI, if you were talking to a new buyer, how would you rank these? If I was to say 1 to 3, what would you say is the most important thing to start looking at, and the others are just as important but take second place and third place?
Wow, that's a good question.
That's a loaded question.
Honestly, even though I believe like there's a lot more value to a business rather than the numbers, but you got to look at the numbers. You got to look at the revenue. You got to look at the income. You got to look at the ad backs, and if the ad backs are reasonable and they're justifiable. If they're not reasonable, do you really want to be entering a transaction with someone that thinks differently to you? So I would say the numbers have to make sense. You have to be able to afford the business, and then you want to do the qualitative checks as well of what they've already put in place.
Right. And so, Joyce, would you agree that perhaps number work is perhaps the first step of many steps?
The number one, yes, would be the numbers, but the number 2 would be your staff, the employees and the management. How long have they been there? If they're only been there for 6 months, maybe to a year, that's a risk, because how much experience do they have? What is their background? And I would do my diligence on the staff and the management as well to reassure myself that they would be there for me when I'm purchasing a company.
No,
longevity, because then you just continue with what you're doing and they help you. They're actually a tool to your toolbox.
And the one thing we haven't even touched on is like there's customers already. You got customers, you got money coming in the door from day one. Like, how expensive and time consuming is it to do business development to get your first customer? I've already got customers. Do you like those customers? Are they recurring? Are they big enough? Is one customer eating up 80% of your revenue, or is it diversified? What's the revenue breakdown on your top 10 customers? So that's value as well. If you have that diversification, you're reducing your risk. That's the sort of the third one, I would say.
Well, that actually in time, it actually ties into your staff employees as well, because that keeps you a revolving door of how experienced they are and in educating the customer that's coming in and keeping them coming in.
Totally.
All right.
Well, just in the interest of time, I think, we don't want to have videos that are too long. Obviously, these points are quite high level discussions. This is just, we've talked about maybe 3 or 4 points, but it's a long list and we definitely haven't touched on a lot of it. We'll definitely be touching on more points as we start publishing more and more of these videos, but stay tuned. If you like what we're publishing, like and subscribe and follow. Feel free to leave any comments you have or any questions you have. As always, Paul, Joyce, and I love looking at deals. If you got a deal you want us to look at, just email us or go on our website and fill up a contact form, and one of us will be in touch with you in a matter of hours. So always a pleasure, Paul, Joyce, and looking forward to you guys.
Thank you, Rusty.
All right.
Thank you,
job.
Paul.